What happens when a calm conversation suddenly takes a turn that nobody on set was expecting? Make sure to subscribe to the Star Talks and like and comment for more talk show coverage. So the segment starts like any other morning on a panel show. The hosts are seated, the audience is settled, there's that familiar low buzz in the studio. People sipping coffee, waiting for something interesting but not necessarily explosive. Alyssa leans forward slightly, smiling toward Michelle, setting the tone in a way that feels friendly but also intentional. Michelle, first of all, it's so great to have you here. I mean, your career has been incredible, and recently you've been speaking more openly about representation and opportunities in Hollywood. Michelle nods politely, hands folded in her lap. Thank you, it's lovely to be here. The audience claps lightly, respectful, warm. Alyssa continues, you've said in interviews that things are changing, but also that there's still a long way to go. I guess my question is, do you think the industry is sometimes being pushed too fast? Like, is there a risk that in trying to fix things, we're creating new kinds of pressure? There's a slight shift in the room. It's subtle, but it's there. Michelle tilts her head just a bit. What kind of pressure do you mean? Alyssa gestures with her hands, trying to clarify. Well, expectations around casting, storytelling. Sometimes it feels like creatives are being told what they should do instead of what they want to do. Before Michelle responds, one of the other hosts softly jumps in, trying to keep it balanced. I think Alyssa's asking whether the pace of change feels natural or forced. Michelle takes a breath. She's still composed, but her tone shifts just slightly. I think when people say too fast, we have to ask, too fast for who? There's a ripple of reaction from the audience. A few murmurs, a couple of claps. Alyssa nods, but she doesn't back off. That's fair. But I think some people feel like they're being labeled or criticized if they don't immediately adapt to every new expectation. Michelle leans forward now, more engaged. But adaptation has always been part of this industry, she says. The difference is, now the voices asking for change are being heard louder than before. The audience responds again, louder this time. Alyssa smiles, but there's a tension behind it. Right, but is there room for disagreement without being shut down? That's what I think a lot of people are concerned about. Michelle pauses, and this is where the tone really begins to shift. Disagreement is fine, she says carefully, but it depends on what you're disagreeing with. The room quiets a bit. Alyssa raises her eyebrows slightly. Meaning, Michelle looks directly at her now. Because if someone is saying, we want more representation, more fairness, more opportunity, and the response is hesitation, then yes, people are going to question that. There's a noticeable reaction from the audience, a mix of applause and a few surprised murmurs. One of the co-hosts jumps in quickly, sensing the tension building. I think what Alyssa's trying to say is, how do we have these conversations without people feeling attacked? Michelle doesn't look away. By listening, she says simply. There's a beat of silence. Alyssa lets out a small breath, then leans back slightly before coming forward again. I agree with listening, but I also think there's a fear right now. People are afraid to even ask questions like this. Michelle responds almost immediately. Why? It's not aggressive, but it's direct. Alyssa pauses for a second, clearly choosing her words. Because sometimes the reaction isn't a conversation, it's judgment. Now the audience is fully tuned in. You can feel the shift, people leaning forward, whispering, sensing that this is no longer just a casual discussion. Michelle nods slowly. But asking questions comes with responsibility, she says. If you're asking from a place of understanding, people can tell. If you're asking from a place of doubt about someone's right to be included, that's different. A few audience members clap again. Alyssa presses her lips together briefly, then responds. I don't think it's about doubting anyone's right to be included. Michelle tilts her head slightly. Then what is it about? There's a pause, just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Another host tries to ease things. This is actually a really important conversation, because I think both of you are touching on something real. But Alyssa doesn't step away. It's about balance, she says. Making sure that in trying to do the right thing, we're not creating new divisions. Michelle's expression changes, not dramatically, but enough to notice. Division already exists, she says. Acknowledging it isn't creating it. The audience reacts again, louder this time. Alyssa nods, but there's a slight edge now. I get that, but I think some people feel like they're being told they're part of the problem just for asking questions. Michelle responds without hesitation. If someone feels that way, maybe it's worth asking why. There's an audible ooh from somewhere in the audience. The tension is no longer subtle. One of the hosts laughs nervously. Okay, we are getting into it this morning. Another host adds, and that's what this table is for, real conversations. But the energy has shifted completely now. Alyssa leans forward again, more serious. I just think there has to be space for people to learn without being immediately criticized. Michelle nods slowly, but her tone stays firm. Learning requires openness, she says, not defensiveness. That lands hard. The audience reacts again, a mix of applause and murmurs. Alyssa looks at her for a moment, then responds. But don't you think sometimes people are labeled as defensive when they're just trying to understand? Michelle doesn't answer right away. And that pause, that brief silence, feels heavier than anything said so far. Because now it's clear. This isn't just a discussion anymore. It's becoming something else. And everyone in the room knows it. The host at the end of the table glances toward the producers off camera, then back at the panel. All right, she says, trying to keep things grounded. We're going to keep this going, because clearly there's a lot to unpack here. The audience claps, some nervously, some excitedly. Michelle sits back slightly, but her eyes stay focused. Alyssa adjusts her posture, preparing to continue. And just like that, what started as a simple question has turned into a moment that's beginning to feel a lot bigger than anyone expected. And it's only just getting started. The applause fades, but the energy doesn't. It lingers in the air, that kind of charged quiet where everyone knows the conversation has crossed into something deeper. Alyssa shifts slightly in her chair, her tone still controlled, but there's more urgency now. I want to be clear, she says, looking directly at Michelle. I'm not disagreeing with the goal. I think most people support fairness, inclusion, all of that. The question is about how we get there without making people feel like they're constantly being judged or corrected. Michelle listens without interrupting, her expression steady. And I understand that concern, she replies. But I think we also have to recognize that for a long time, certain groups didn't even have the space to speak at all. So when they finally do, it might feel louder or more intense. But that's because it hasn't been heard before. The audience nods along, a few claps breaking through. Alyssa responds quickly, not wanting to lose the moment. But does that mean there's no room for nuance? Because sometimes it feels like if you don't say things exactly the right way, you're immediately criticized. Michelle leans forward again, her voice calm but firmer now. Nuance is important, she says. But accountability is also important. There's a slight pause. And sometimes, Michelle continues, what people call criticism is actually just accountability. That lands heavily. The audience reacts, louder this time. Some applause, some murmurs, a few people clearly surprised at how direct the exchange has become. One of the co-hosts raises her hand slightly, trying to step in. I think what's interesting here is that both of you are talking about fear, just from different sides. She turns to Alyssa. You're talking about fear of saying the wrong thing. Then to Michelle. And you're talking about fear of not being heard at all. There's a brief moment where it seems like that might diffuse things. But Alyssa leans in again. Exactly. And I think both fears are valid. That's why I think the conversation has to allow for mistakes without immediate backlash. Michelle nods once, but her response comes quickly. Mistakes are part of learning. But repeating the same mistakes, especially when people have already explained why they're harmful, that's different. The audience reacts again, a louder mix now. Alyssa exhales softly, a small shake of her head. But who decides what counts as a mistake versus just a different perspective? Michelle's eyes stay locked on her. Usually the people who are affected by it. There's a noticeable shift in the room again, that subtle tightening of attention. Alyssa pauses for a second, then responds. But doesn't that risk shutting down broader discussion? Because if only one group gets to define what's acceptable, where does that leave everyone else? Before Michelle can answer, another host jumps in, sensing the tension rising again. I think what Alyssa is getting at is, how do we make sure conversations stay open instead of becoming one-sided? Michelle turns slightly toward the rest of the table, but her response is still clearly directed. Conversations are open when people listen, she says. Not when they center themselves in every discussion. That draws a strong reaction. Louder applause now, mixed with a few audible sounds from the audience. Alyssa gives a small, tight smile. I don't think asking questions is centering yourself, she says. Michelle responds immediately. It depends on how and why you're asking. Now the tension is unmistakable. The audience quiets again, sensing that this isn't just a difference of opinion anymore. It's a direct clash in perspectives. Alyssa sits up straighter, her tone sharpening just slightly. So are you saying that people should hesitate before asking questions if they're worried about how it might come across? Michelle shakes her head. I'm saying they should think about the impact of their words, she replies. That's not hesitation. That's awareness. A few claps break out again. Alyssa looks out briefly toward the audience, then back at Michelle. But isn't there a risk that people become so concerned about impact that they stop engaging altogether? Michelle pauses this time, and that pause feels deliberate. If someone stops engaging because they're asked to be mindful, she says, then maybe they weren't really engaging in the first place. There's a collective reaction, a mix of whoa and applause. One of the hosts lets out a small laugh, clearly trying to lighten the mood. Okay, this is definitely one of those conversations where nobody's backing down. The audience chuckles, but the tension remains. Alyssa leans forward again, her voice calm but more pointed now. I just think there has to be a middle ground, where people can learn, ask questions, and yes, even disagree, without immediately being seen as part of the problem. Michelle listens carefully, then nods once. I agree that people should be able to learn, she says. But learning also means being willing to hear things that might make you uncomfortable. The audience reacts again, softer this time, but engaged. Alyssa responds, of course. But discomfort shouldn't automatically mean someone is wrong. Michelle's reply is quick. No, but it can mean there's something worth examining. Another ripple through the audience. At this point, even the hosts who've been quieter are leaning in, fully engaged. One of them adds, this is actually something viewers talk about all the time. Where is that line between healthy debate and harmful messaging? Alyssa nods. Exactly. And I think that line is becoming harder to define. Michelle turns slightly toward her again. Or maybe it's just becoming harder to ignore. That gets one of the biggest reactions yet, applause mixed with a few surprised laughs. Alyssa lets out a small breath, her expression thoughtful but still firm. I think we're both saying something important, she says. But I worry that if the conversation only goes one way, people will stop participating altogether. Michelle's gaze softens just a fraction, but her tone remains steady. Then the goal should be to make the conversation better, she says. Not to avoid it. There's a moment of silence. And in that silence, you can feel it, the shift from a simple disagreement into something more layered, more personal, more real. The host at the center of the table glances toward the camera briefly, then back at the panel. You know, she says, this is one of those discussions that doesn't have an easy answer. But it's important that we're having it. The audience claps, but it's not the same kind of applause from earlier. It's more reflective now. Michelle sits back slightly, her hands resting calmly again, but her attention hasn't wavered. Alyssa adjusts her posture, clearly still engaged, still ready to continue. Because despite everything that's been said so far, it doesn't feel like either of them is finished. And the conversation is about to go even deeper. There's a brief pause after that last exchange, but it's not the kind that settles things. It's the kind that builds pressure. One of the hosts exhales audibly, glancing between both of them. Okay, I feel like we're right on the edge of something here. A few nervous laughs ripple through the audience. Alyssa leans back for a second, then forward again, as if she's deciding whether to push further. And then she does. Let me ask you this, she says, her tone measured but more direct than before. Do you think there's ever a point where people are trying to show support, but it's still not enough? Michelle doesn't hesitate this time. Yes, she says plainly. The audience reacts instantly, some clapping, some murmuring. Alyssa nods slowly. Okay, so how does someone know what enough looks like? Because that's where I think people get confused. Michelle shifts slightly in her seat, her hands now resting more firmly on the table. It's not about reaching a point where you can say, I've done enough, she explains. It's about ongoing awareness, ongoing effort. Alyssa tilts her head, but that can feel like there's no finish line. Michelle meets her gaze. Why does there need to be one? That lands sharply. There's a noticeable reaction from the audience. A few louder claps, some surprised expressions. Alyssa presses her lips together, then responds. Because people want to feel like they're making progress without constantly being told they're falling short. Michelle nods, but her expression tightens just slightly. Progress isn't always comfortable, she says. And it doesn't always come with validation. The room goes quiet again. Alyssa looks down briefly, then back up. I understand that, she says. But I also think there's a difference between encouraging growth and making people feel like they can't get it right. Before Michelle can respond, Another host jumps in, her tone thoughtful. This is where it gets complicated, because intention and impact don't always line up. Michelle turns toward her. Exactly. Then back to Alyssa. Someone can have good intentions and still cause harm, she says. Alyssa responds quickly. I agree with that. But if someone is trying to learn and keeps being told they're causing harm, eventually they might just disengage. Michelle's reply comes almost immediately. And if they disengage, who does that help? There's a small wave of murmurs in the audience. Alyssa leans forward, her voice a bit firmer now. It doesn't help anyone. But I think we have to acknowledge that not everyone has the same level of understanding right away. Michelle nods once. That's true, she says. But access to understanding is greater now than it's ever been. The audience reacts again, a mix of agreement and quiet consideration. Alyssa gestures lightly with her hands. But access doesn't always mean clarity, she says. There's so much information, so many perspectives, it can be overwhelming. Michelle listens, then responds in a slightly softer tone. It can be, she says. But that's why listening matters more than speaking sometimes. Alyssa pauses, then gives a small nod. I don't disagree with that, she says. But I also think conversations like this show how easily things can become tense, even when both sides are trying to engage. Michelle looks at her steadily. Do you think this is tense? She asks. There's a slight ripple through the audience. That question catches people off guard. Alyssa hesitates for just a second. I think it's honest, she says carefully. But I think it could feel tense to people watching. Michelle considers that, then nods slightly. Honest conversations can feel tense, she says. Especially when they challenge us. The audience responds with a few claps. Alyssa leans back again, taking a breath, then leans forward once more. I just don't want people to feel like they're being shut out of the conversation, she says. Because if that happens, we lose the opportunity to actually make progress together. Michelle's expression softens slightly, but her voice remains steady. I agree that people shouldn't be shut out, she says. But being part of the conversation also means being willing to hear things that might not feel good. Alyssa nods. And I think that's fair. There's a brief moment where it almost feels like the tension might ease. But then Alyssa adds one more thing. I just think there's a difference between being challenged and being dismissed. The room quiets again. Michelle responds, her tone measured. Yes, there is. A pause. But sometimes people interpret being challenged as being dismissed. That draws another reaction, a mix of applause and a few surprised murmurs. Alyssa exhales softly, a slight shake of her head. And sometimes, she says, people feel dismissed because their perspective isn't being acknowledged. Michelle leans forward slightly. Then the question is, what perspective is being asked to be acknowledged? Now the tension rises again. Alyssa meets her gaze. The perspective of someone trying to understand without being immediately categorized, she says. Michelle responds without looking away. And what happens when that understanding still questions someone else's lived experience? There's an audible reaction from the audience, a collective intake of breath, followed by scattered applause. Alyssa pauses. For the first time, she doesn't respond immediately. The silence stretches just long enough to feel heavy. One of the hosts steps in quickly, her voice slightly more urgent now. Okay, I think this is where we're really getting into the heart of it. Lived experience versus broader perspective. She looks at both of them. And I think both of you are speaking to something that a lot of people struggle with right now. The audience nods, some clapping in agreement. Alyssa finally speaks again, her tone quieter but still firm. I'm not questioning anyone's lived experience, she says. I'm saying that people outside of that experience are trying to learn how to engage without making mistakes. Michelle nods slowly. And I'm saying that part of that learning is accepting that mistakes will be called out, she replies. Another wave of reaction from the audience. Alyssa leans back slightly, her expression thoughtful. And I think that's where the fear comes in, she says. Because being called out publicly can feel like being shut down, even if that's not the intention. Michelle pauses. Then she responds, her tone slightly softer than before. Maybe, she says. But silence doesn't create understanding either. There's a quiet moment. No immediate applause this time, just people processing. The host at the center glances around the table, then toward the audience. You can feel how real this is, she says. This isn't just a theoretical conversation. This is something people are dealing with every day. The audience claps, more steadily now. Michelle sits back again, her posture composed, but her eyes still focused. Alyssa nods slowly, her expression a mix of reflection and resolve. Neither of them looks ready to walk away from the discussion. If anything, it feels like they've only just reached the core of it. And as the cameras keep rolling, it's clear that whatever comes next is going to leave an impact. There's a shift after that last moment. Not a break in the conversation, but a change in its weight. The kind where everyone in the room realizes they've gone past surface-level discussion and into something that's going to stick. The central host glances toward the camera, then back at the table, her voice steady but slightly softer. I think what we're seeing right now is what real dialogue actually looks like, she says. It's not always comfortable, it's not always clean, but it's real. The audience responds with a round of applause. Not loud or explosive, but sustained, thoughtful. Alyssa nods slowly, her posture easing just a little, though the seriousness in her expression hasn't gone anywhere. I appreciate this conversation, she says, turning slightly toward Michelle. Even if it's not easy, I think it's important. Michelle meets her gaze and gives a small nod. It is, she says. And I appreciate that you're willing to stay in it. There's a brief moment of mutual acknowledgement, not agreement, but recognition. One of the other hosts leans in, smiling slightly, trying to bridge the tone. And I think that's the key, right? Staying in the conversation, even when it gets uncomfortable. A few audience members clap in agreement. But before the energy can fully settle, the central host adds one more question, almost carefully. Michelle, do you think conversations like this are helping move things forward? Or do they risk deepening divides? Michelle pauses. It's not a long pause, but it's enough to signal that she's choosing her words carefully. I think they can do both, she says. It depends on what people take away from them. The audience quiets, listening closely. If someone watches this and feels defensive, or feels like they're being attacked, then maybe it deepens that divide, she continues. But if someone watches this and thinks, maybe I need to listen more or understand more, then it moves things forward. Alyssa nods slowly, absorbing that. And I would add, she says, if someone watches this and feels like they're allowed to ask questions without being shut down, that also helps move things forward. There's a small ripple of applause. Michelle looks at her, then nods again. Yes, she says. As long as those questions come with a willingness to hear the answers. The audience reacts, a balanced mix of clapping and quiet murmurs. The host smiles slightly, sensing that they've reached a natural closing point. I think that's a good place to leave it, she says. Not because the conversation is over, but because it's one that should keep going. Applause fills the studio again, a bit stronger this time. The tension hasn't disappeared, but it's shifted into something more reflective. The cameras begin to pull back slightly as the hosts exchange small smiles and nods, but the atmosphere is still charged. The kind of energy that doesn't just fade the moment the segment ends. As the show cuts to a brief break, the on-air microphones pick up a few softer, off-script moments. One host leans toward Michelle, speaking quietly but still faintly audible. That was intense. Michelle lets out a small breath, a slight smile forming. These conversations usually are. Alyssa adjusts her notes, then glances over. I hope it came across the right way, she says. Michelle responds calmly. It came across honestly. There's a small nod between them. Not a resolution, but a recognition. Then the feed cuts. But that's not where the story ends. Because within minutes of the segment airing, clips begin circulating online. Short excerpts of the exchange, especially those sharper moments, start appearing across social media platforms. Viewers begin reacting almost immediately. Some praise Michelle for her directness, saying she articulated things that often go unsaid. Others side with Alyssa, arguing that she voiced concerns many people are hesitant to express. And as expected, some reactions fall somewhere in between, saying both perspectives mattered, even if they didn't fully align. The debate spreads quickly. Comment sections fill up with long threads of people breaking down specific lines from the conversation. That too fast for who moment, wow. Michelle stayed calm but made her point very clear. Alyssa wasn't wrong to ask those questions. It felt tense but also necessary. Clips get reposted, analyzed, and debated. Even other media outlets begin picking it up, discussing the exchange as an example of how conversations around these topics are evolving in real time. Backstage, after the show wraps, the atmosphere is quieter but still reflective. Crew members move around, resetting equipment, but you can tell the conversation hasn't fully left the room. One of the producers approaches Alyssa briefly. That was a big segment, they say. Alyssa nods, exhaling. Yeah, it felt big. Across the room, Michelle is speaking with another member of the team, her tone calm, measured. There's no visible frustration, no dramatic reaction, just a quiet sense of having said what needed to be said. As the hosts begin to leave the set, there are small exchanges, brief words, nods, a few thoughtful looks. No one is pretending nothing happened, but no one is escalating it either. It's the kind of aftermath that feels real, not neatly resolved, but not chaotic either. Just ongoing. And that's what makes the moment stick. Because it wasn't about a dramatic blow-up or a clear winner. It was about two different perspectives meeting in real time, in front of an audience, without a script to smooth it out. And for viewers watching at home, that's what made it resonate. It felt real. It felt unscripted. It felt like the kind of conversation people are having, or trying to have, every day. And as the online discussion continues to grow, one thing becomes clear. This wasn't just another segment. It was a moment people are going to keep talking about. So what do you think? Was Michelle right to challenge those questions so directly? Or did Alyssa raise a valid point about how these conversations are happening? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the Star Talks for more real talk show stories.